Hi, my name is Lucy Carey, coming to you not from Portland but from London, and this is kind of appropriate because this is a talk about globalizing your docs. My background's quite mixed, everything from technical documentation to translation and localization, primarily working with Japanese text. Just for context, by the way, this is a talk about localizing your English content into other languages, just for reference, so that's what will be my target reference throughout. Hopefully this talk will be useful for you if you've worked with localization guidance and you want to learn a little bit more about the area, you want to really think about what's behind some of those principles, or it may be that you've got translation and localization in your future timeline and you're actually looking for some solid things to think about. Whichever case, I'm going to outline some things that you will need to do if this is the goal you want to pursue. I've kept things quite high level on the basis that there is a lot to take in, but also some of the really fundamental principles for localization and translation will feed directly into your English docs too and help to make them and improve them. There are some secret benefits for your organization as well that I'll be talking about. So hopefully everyone will have something to take away. So primary, translation and localization. The first important thing to know is that they are siblings, not twins. What does that mean? Translation, language alone. A topical analogy klaxon here. But at the start of the lockdown, many of us were forced to move from our offices to our home working environments. You don't have a lovely office desk and a fancy chair anymore. You've got your bed and maybe there's a dog jumping, a child screaming, but you're still expected to have that same output at the end of the day. You're still expected to deliver those docs in that same time frame, in theory. Many of us realized very soon that you could not just translate a working scenario directly from the office to a home. We've made adaptations along the way. It may be that you've shifted some of your sprint cycles because it's difficult to get that collaboration with teams in the way that you had before. It may be, if like me, you do video training, you've kind of had to really think about how you deliver those sessions, making sure they're as interactive as they can be and that you're engaging people even when you're not in that same room. And look at that, we've kind of arrived on the second analogy. So localization. Localization is language and context. It's recognizing that language and culture are intrinsically bound and you can't just separate one out from the other. It may be that our messaging is quite casual in English, like, hey guys, we got this totally sweet release, check it out. And then you're going to a target market that's used to very, very formal language, very respectful. If we just did a direct translation there, that would be really inappropriate and they might be quite offended. On a more pragmatic though, it can mean things like date formats are different in your region. Japanese and English dates are not the same. Even UK American, not the same necessarily. It could be that the bandwidth in your region that you're translating for actually is quite lower and you've got a lot of really dense imagery in your documentation. You may need to rethink because that's not going to be accessible to your users in that same way. Localization is about recognizing these differences, making them work, because again, you are dealing with technical documentation. And the outcome for any user, wherever they are, should be exactly the same. The script should run the same. They should just be able to write this piece of code and work with this software. It may be that you have made some slight tweaks as you go, but the net result is not going to differ wherever you are. So tweak, but don't fuck things up. It may be tempting, particularly if you've got some older content that you're translating and think, oh, well, we can just make some changes into the documentation. We need to improve it a little bit, so we'll just do this here. This is so tempting, but please don't do this because whatever you do, your English content will be your core source of truth. People, particularly if your translation is coming a bit later and they're used to working with that English, will see discrepancies as a mistake on the translation. They will see that as a mistranslation. They will see this as an error and they will judge it negatively because of that, even if paradoxically it's better. So don't succumb. Translation and localization can be a totally new kind of product journey governed by different cultural contexts. Moving fast and breaking things isn't always an option. If you're wondering why I'm reading verbatim from the slide, it's to kind of help inculcate this to you because you may need to repeat this a lot. As a technical writer or a content person, you're probably already used to kind of being an interlocutor for your users. When you're weighing in on a decision, you're kind of always putting that person who reps for that user for what they want, what's going to be a good experience for them. Congratulations, you're now a diplomat if you're in that localization process, because the cultural context that you're thinking about is going to be so much wider than your own. For example, in the West, we are very used to, particularly in that kind of US Silicon Valley culture, chucking out a new user release to our people, giving people a sneak peek, letting them get their hands on, but this product's not quite ready, we've just The doc suite's just kind of still in development, but when you're really excited, so you want to have a go. Maybe not so exciting for your sales teams in some regions who are presented with this mission to just go and copy what we've done in California or London and expecting it will stick. Actually, for some teams, giving a customer something that's not 100% ready, that maybe would have an error in, if the customer came to them and identified this error, this would be so shameful and it will be so bad for that relationship. I've had to bat for a team who are having this pressure on them to say, actually, if you're putting this investment in this localization, if you are putting all this work into this process, don't at the final hurdle blow it by not thinking about that local regional context. If you're not sure what that's going to be, talk to people in the region. Maybe you've got teams out there, let them lead you. Maybe do some consultancy, talk to other experts in the area, but don't slip up when you've done all this work already. So, arguments for investing in translation and localization. English is the most common second language in the world. A lot of people might say, why do we need to bother translating? It's so expensive and it's a lot of things to think about. However, English is paradoxical because it is most people's second language, maybe third, fourth. It's not the language that they grew up speaking, and fluency runs on a spectrum. This means I may have really contextual familiarity with a certain area of a language, maybe simple technical English or a certain suite of products I'm really used to working with, and my vocabulary is okay there, I feel quite comfortable. But if you were to want to have a spoken conversation, I might feel a bit uneasy about that because I don't have that wider vocabulary at the tip of my brain. It may be that I've just not had to use it in 20 years and I just don't feel practiced in that. It may be, again, as well, that I'm used to kind of having spoken conversations with users and my conversational English is quite good. But then if it was a really specialist technical area, I may not immediately have that vocabulary, even if I have it in my own language. So it may be that even if you're emailing your users, if they're interacting with in a forum, you just expect that your docs will be fine and welcome received. That may not actually be the case. In one global study, 55% of people said they only buy from websites with information in their native language. And this actually gets much wider for when it comes to second purchase. And that preference for localized, translated secondary information, so things like docs, things like user support, actually rises to over 70%. And totally understandable. Again, that superficial level, maybe I can basically understand the description of the product, but when it comes to really getting into the fundamentals, I don't want to be having to worry about getting out my dictionary while I'm wrangling with your code. Untranslated content on a really pragmatic level can also present legal challenges. It may be that I actually love your English content and as a company and I really want to use your product, but my company has a policy that if we don't have translated contracts, if maybe we don't have that sort of service level stuff, that support, documentation, we're not allowed to sign a contract. And this can be a really big barrier. So maybe you kind of don't understand why you're not getting deals from a region. This could be a reason why. So maybe you've been convinced by that. You want to go ahead with this translation. How are you going to do it? Because there are a lot of options. Number one, human. Here is Miss Sandy. Oldest example of a translator in the world, just one human. When you are going to go for a human translator, I would say particularly if you've got something like what I would refer to as boutique copy. So maybe it's an email to your customers, maybe it's a release note that you want to be quite colloquial with your users in. Maybe it's something like an apology message for an outage. Go no further than a human, whether that's someone in your local office or a contractor or whatever. You want someone who is primarily not only a translator, but as a translator, the first thing that you learn is that you have to be really strong in your own language and communication skills. A lot of the time you're going to have to look for an elegant solution because something does not translate exactly. You're going to really need to know that nuance and tone and telegraph that really well to your users. So again, go no further there. It may be, however, that you've got hundreds of thousands of words and you want to move at a really fast pace, in which case an option for you is probably going to be working with a third-party translation agency, who in turn will have their external networks of translators. It'd be quite unusual for this just all to be in-house. And this translation can move a little bit like data. You might have massive volumes coming in one small burst, and then there could be quite lags, more drip feed. So you want the company to be able to engage as many translators as it needs to get a job done in a certain period of time. One thing to bear in mind, obviously, with this relationship is you are not going to be interviewing the translators like you would a normal content person. You will going to have to regularly check your content for discrepancies, things that are coming through. It may not be possible to vet all the translators in the process. There may be occasion that you actually think, oh, well, this person's not quite right. So that's going to be something that you maybe need to be aware of. A thing that you sometimes have to alleviate this is an editor. This is particularly useful if you have a lot of people on a job that is moving quite quickly. Humans are making different choices for different verbs. If there's a homonymic choice, something that I could have multiple verb examples of something, again, I would probably want someone to just be at the end of that process and just go through and refine that and make sure that's all in order and as consistent as it can be. Again, when you're using human translation, you need to think about things like cost as well, translated time, edited time, and that's all going to be part of your package. This being 2020, humans obviously not just writing on Microsoft Word file or whatever alone. A lot of them are using something called computer-assisted translation, which you'll refer to as CAT or a CAT tool. CAT tools leave translation memories over time and they help speed up human translation work. So say I translate the word Kawasaki once, it would spot that and automatically input that in my translation later on in the file. It breaks my document up into, the CAT tool will break my document up into segments, so anything from words to sentences, and it will store this in a database called a translation memory, which is basically, as I said, capturing that translation work for future use. When I move to a new segment for translation, the software will check in the translation memory if there is an identical result, and it will put the most appropriate thing in the target. It may give me a percentage score match, saying, yeah, bang, this is 100%, good, don't need to do anything, or it may be sort of a fuzzy match, and I know that I need to look into that, and I may, as a translator, need to overwrite what's in that machine. Occasionally, I could get something given to me, and at first glance, I think, oh, this is all kind of done for me, as I read down, and then actually think, oh no, there's actually quite a bit of work to do. But a lot of the heavy lifting has been done. I don't really need to do that really boring, automated, just writing things out again and again. My brain's freed up to finish the job thinking about the really gnarly bits of phrase that I need to work on. If you're curious to know what a CAT tool looks like, this is a tool I used recently called Smartly. The first file is the English, and that is your source. The second file is the translation, and that's known as sort of your target, so your target language, your target region. The source has been pulled into the tool, and then I could go into that right-hand column there, and I could change it or edit it as I like, or just approve it. At the top of the tool, you can look contextually and see what your language looks like on the page. But as you probably observed, this little string, this is what is referred to in Smartly as a string, is quite bitty, although it's part of a big text. Seeing it from this translator's viewpoint, it's just a very small contextless little fragment. So when we are talking about optimizing your language for translation as well, bear in mind that a lot of your translators may not necessarily be seeing things on one page. Sometimes you will just get sent a CSV file, almost like an Excel doc, and it will just have the translation and the source either side. Again, I'm not seeing things contextually in a big way. I'm having to rely on the words there. So if it's really complex, if things don't make sense, if there is ambiguity, it's going to be exacerbated within this approach. So machine. Maybe you want to save a lot of money, and machine translation is definitely cheaper than humans in 2020 as well. It's also much better than it used to be. Most of us have probably used it when we were on holiday. It's not perfect though. As we said, language is very fluid. It's changing all the time. It is culturally bound. You're going to get a lot of matches that don't always make sense. I've experimented with machine translation alone for a project before, and what we found was it broke the sentences up in really sort of strange and, to our human brain, irrational ways. And it took a lot of the UI labels and verbalized them, and it actually took longer to unpick the mistakes and to put it into something coherent than it would have just cost to get a human to do it in the first place. However, machine translation, again, it's instant because it's not relying on anything like a translation memory. It's just finding the matches for your complex series of algorithms, and it's serving them to you instantaneously. If I've got something like an error message, if I've got something like a patch that I need to push out really rapidly, and I want to have that basic service level agreement to my customers, some companies will use machine translation for that. What you may find is that they do write a little disclaimer at the top saying this is a machine translation. There may be some errors and inconsistencies in here, just so your users are aware of that. And that's a great tip for that user experience, because again, if you have that wacky machine translation coming through, your users may not know it's a machine translation at first and just kind of be very confused. combination then may be your answer. So you have a team of third-party translators working on your core bread and butter docs. You want that assurance that there's not going to be inconsistencies, that there's not going to be errors accidentally translated in. Maybe you've got an editor in that process too, making sure it's congruent with your UI and your platform. But then maybe for things like your community docs, which you don't edit in English anyway, but you kind of want to have a basic level, machine translation could be the answer there. So for things like fast-moving content, maybe again, like your patches, something that you've had to release very quickly and you will translate in time, machine translation could be your answer. So TLDR, human for top quality, amazing docs, or any kind of content really. Machine for expediency, and maybe a combination is your path to make a docs joe. The planning considerations. Okay, so you've got your translation in process mind, you kind of know how you're going to do it. Here's some things that you are going to need to think about in your sprint cycles. So number 1, cadence. Are you going to sync with your English releases? How is that going to work? So maybe you have an English release every week. Are you going to slow that down so your translated docs can come out simultaneously? Are you going to plan for later in the month? So like our English docs come out this week and then 2 weeks later we'll have all our translated docs. How's that going to work? Again, there's probably no right or wrong answer for this. It might be what works best for your organization and your size and your team and your capability, but it's something worth thinking about at the start of that journey. User experience. Are you aiming to provide an exact match for your users? Often with localization and translation, what we can find is a compromise being made, particularly when it comes to resources. Maybe you don't have the resources at the current time to do an exact user experience match, but you want to get as close as possible. A common thing with translation is that jumpy docs journey, so that maybe part of a suite of documentation being translated, and I'm working with that and I'm happy, I'm loving the translation. I click through and suddenly it's gone back to the original language. And I'm maybe even tempted to play with the language toggle to see if there's an issue there, what's gone wrong, because my user journey has effectively just dropped off. In situations like this, it's quite nice to just put a little disclaimer again, saying this content has not been translated, we're sorry, we aim to get something out as soon as possible, or even just this content's not translated, don't try and change it. It is difficult as well sometimes with translation. People can be really excited about that translation and localization process, but then the balance can become a bit more imbalanced down the line when people start thinking about all the things they have to do and all the costs that are running up. Again, as that technical docs, as that content person, you may find yourself having to do a little bit of advocacy in that area too, because wherever you are, you want your users to be having the best experience possible. Time. Just quite simply, translators can often be left as a very last moment thing. And just like if you give an editor 5 minutes to edit something that you worked on for 5 weeks, you are not going to get the best result. You are not going to get as thorough and cohesive as you would like. If your translators are working against the metal to provide something, you're more likely to get errors, you're more likely to get mistakes being made, and that's going to have an impact on your users. So if you can, think ahead to build in that time for them to work as best as they can. Accessibility doesn't go away just because you're putting it into another language. So think about things like how you will translate your alt text, any captions that you have, any subtitles, how that's going to work. Other media as well, and this is the bit when sometimes you say people want to throw up in their mouth a bit when they start thinking about it, because things like images, screenshots particularly, videos, diagrams, and any other assets that you have, and particularly third-party documentation that you may not be allowed to translate legally. You want to be aware of this stuff at the start of the process, because once you hit that roadblock halfway through of suddenly the cost of translating our screenshots and what's that going to take, because that can be quite complex, that might really throw a spanner in the works. So again, forewarned is forearmed. Think about how you are going to deal with that, what your approach is going to be, and have that in place before you jump in. So optimizing for world domination. Pro level hack, clear accessible English documentation is perfect for translation. So if you already feel like you're writing in a really accessible, clear way and your users are really happy and engaged, congratulations, you're really on the path for localization joy there. True translation is not a binary affair between two languages, but a triangular affair. The third point of the triangle being what lay behind the words of the original text before it was written. And this is a quote from a book called Confabulations by an author called John Berger, who was a writer and also a linguist, and he really kind of understood about that sound world and the context behind the words that we say. This quote really stood out to me when I was working on a UI translation project. As we probably know in the development process, sometimes a word or a term will find its way into the design map, gain critical mass as it rolls through the plan and production, and it ends up in your finalized product. But actually the words don't kind of make sense. If I was to ask for a simple English dictionary definition, you may not be able to give it to me. So for a translator, what are you going to do? You're either going to have to write that phonetically, which if I'm doing that all the time through a product is going to be really annoying for that user. Think of English text with loads of shouty cats in, have that interruptive feeling. And it's not going to really help my users understand my product any better on either side of the spectrum, English or whatever language I'm working in. So thinking about the words that you say, thinking about your verb choices, really think, does this verb actually articulate the action properly? This proper noun that I've used, does it necessarily make sense, or does it just sound a bit zeitgeisty and cool? And could we come up with a better, more declarative thing? And if you can, please use that. Diminishing returns, much like a witch's curse, poorly written content will really rebound on you in your translation. Any inconsistencies will be exacerbated. Any things that are not clear, that are ambiguous in English, the chances of that being articulately well for your users and people understanding what you're saying goes down. So if you are thinking, we've got some docs we really need to improve, but we also want to translate them, we'll translate it and then we'll improve it. Number one, you're going to build up a lot of cost because then you're going to have to translate your improvements again, so you're paying for it double time. You're also building in cost by submitting lower quality docs because it might be your translators really struggle and the quality of what they give you is not what you want, so you keep sending it back, you keep having to have back and forth with them. So that's building up time cost as well. And frankly, you're kind of building up a lot of work for your users on either side having to pass this tricky documentation. It's much better to work on your source before you go for the translation. So what do your translators want your source writers to remember when you are looking at that optimal docs? Snacks. And this isn't just something I will reach for if you give me a translation file and it's all in PDF. It is a framework that I have conducted for this tech talk. So, to start, sensible headers. Again, really clean, declarative. Going back to thinking of how I might see that in a cat tool. Does the content flow down neatly from the header? Does the header explicitly articulate what's happening in the paragraph or procedure below? You may see something in localization guidance about avoiding gerunds. In fact, some tech companies avoid them completely in your docs. This is because of the grammatical construct. It doesn't universally translate into all languages. Gerunds can be useful as sort of an opening to a suite of processes, particularly if you've got a lot of different kind of verb actions can convey within that phrase. However, for translators, it can be quite ambiguous. It's also something that, while it can be useful if I kind of want to do, if I want to writing very quickly, actually stepping back and really thinking, is there a clearer way to articulate this process? Does this verb really express the exact action here? And if I can think of a better, more coherent choice, definitely use that. No figurative or idiomatic language. I read a really interesting book recently that kind of talked about Latin as a former mass language of the world. And what was interesting about Latin is because it was a language of the church, I could be reading documents in Latin in England or Greece or a far-flung part of the European continent. And even though we were totally regionally diverse, because people were reading the same concepts, they were reading things with the same philosophical background, people could really follow that universal language. English, as we said, really, really widely spoken, but my context as a person, say, in a tiny mining village in Wales versus someone in Beijing, the associations that I have with certain words, certain things that I may find kind of offensive, things that I may find really funny or surprising to see in a doc because it just doesn't make sense to me in my lived daily life. If that crops up in your documentation, can be quite confusing. For your translators, sometimes if you've got something really idiomatic, they may just kind of give up and translate that into your doc. So you've got this normal sentence and then suddenly there's a horse running through. If it's something that's a potential point of friction, if you think, what do I have to explain this word? Is there a long story behind it for me to articulate the meaning? In which case, put something more simple in. Active language, secret source of every good piece of technical documentation or tech content in general. What's doing what to what? Again, if you've got passive language, if it's really ambiguous, the chances of getting an inconsistent translation go up. Chances of your translators just kind of giving up and writing what they think it means, rather than something really direct increases to. Consistency, as I said, with a verb, you may have 2 or 3 different translation choices for one verb. If I've got 2 or 3 different English verbs already, I'm throwing in multiple language choices too. Already you can see that my documentation is going to get quite confused in that translation, and particularly if there's 2 or 3 translators in that process. For my translators trying to get this product journey down for my users in a different region, if I'm struggling to get that concept in English, again, that translation is going to be a bit gnarly. Keep punctuation minimal. As we know, minimal punctuation makes for less complex sentences. That's better for your users in any region. If I've got a lot of things like end dashes in the middle of sentences, lots of bitty things, as a reader, that's a higher cognitive load. I'm having to remember bits of the sentence as I work through to get the full meaning. As a translator, that's complex too, particularly if something could be multiple sentences and I'm having to incorporate that into a completely new verb subject order. Then again, the chances of error are much higher, the chances of something that reads coherently are lower. Simple sentences as well. Ideally, throughout your documentation, follow that subject-verb order. Don't get experimental. Again, better for all your users. I know as a writer, sometimes it can be really boring to feel like you're writing the same sentence over and over, but thinking about how your users pass through your documentation, they are not going to know. And thinking about people using things like translation memory tools as well. The more similar sentences, the more sentences that look alike there are for your documentation, the more the tool can leverage that. So less work for your translators, less chance of inaccuracies creeping in, and a better experience for all. So what to review even when you can't read the docs? Maybe you are just, everything is happening third party, but you feel like kind of a level of obligation to your users to actually do what you can to make sure you're delivering the best result. This is some guidance for you. Are the links correct? Could be common if you are translating something. Maybe you've translated a bit of content and gone back and later on done something else. And the old English links are still in there. Just go and have a click through and see if you can update those. Does the new text look right on the page? If I'm writing in a different script, particularly something that doesn't necessarily run left to right, things may go a bit wonky, maybe get some overlaps. I may need to do some work on the CSS on that page. How do table charts and diagrams look? If I translate something to German, it's a massive compound word. Maybe that's now blurring out my diagrams, particularly with Asian scripts. If I've got centered headers on my tables, that can break in the middle of the header and look a bit funny. Again, I can go in and sort of see this as a non-native speaker, someone who doesn't even necessarily read that script. I'll know if it's overrun, if it looks strange, and I can maybe help sort that out. And finally, has any rogue English slip through? I did say in this presentation I was going to talk about how you deal with a platform that's not necessarily translated even when you're translating your docs. So I'm going to mention that now. In this case, so say I've got a UI label and my UI label is push, and I know I'm not translating push. What I would do in that first instance of mentioning that in the documentation is I would put a translation next to it in parenthesis. And it may be that my tool that I'm using has already identified this as a do not translate word, and if the translator accidentally translates it, it will overwrite it for me. But then I might ask them, can you actually provide a translation as well, so we can have that? Treat this like an abbreviation, so if my user goes through my documentation, they can go back to that original translation and they've got that reference to anchor them. It may be, however, that just whatever tool you're using to crawl your site to find the new content to translate has just missed something and that slipped through a release. It may be that my content's being auto-translated and served to the user before it's reviewed, and it may be that the whole translation's not finished, so what I get is kind of a bit of a ragged doc that's like Chinese, English, but Chinese, a bit more English. Sometimes it may be okay with your target audience, but often your market might actually prefer if you, again, just have that word, that content left untranslated in one language with a disclaimer saying this is being translated, it's coming. So I'm not having that really strange user experience. So useful things to pack for taking your docs on tour. Star guidance, as you can see here, this is a bilingual star guide. This is because the person managing all your translations and localizations may not speak all the languages that you are rolling out, but they maybe need to manage the translators, they need to manage the translation companies, they need to have context and grounding to know if there's a problem. A glossary, again, this is a list of brand terminology in the source language, and you can create it for your target languages too as you kind of adapt. Think what do we want our standard glossary for these UI terms, for example, to be. It also provides a shared understanding of everyone in the company or brand terms as you start to build out. You may actually have to really look back and define the words in the language that you've used before and think, what do we mean here? And arrive on a shared definition. And it may be that you have to work with different teams that you've not worked with before in the company to do this. And it may be a bit of a time-consuming job, but it really will be worth it. And when you kind of got to the point where you've compiled your style guidance, you've got your glossary, you've got those assets, maybe you want someone not just managing your translations in the process, but who is going to manage those assets as well. When you update, obviously content moves quite quickly. When you are making changes, you're going to need to sync those changes through your docs too. Your manager will be on top of that, and they will make sure that things are all happening in beautiful harmony. So finding a balance. Right now you're probably thinking, this translation localization thing sounds quite stressful. There's a lot of overheads. And I won't lie, it can be sometimes. However, everything gets easier over time. As you start showing your users in your new market your documentation, getting that feedback, that will become a kind of dialogue that, as with your English documentation when you began, you will put into your updates. You will think about your tone. You will definitely have some revisions to make. You're going to have some things that look goofy when they land originally, just because of some maybe idiosyncrasies in your publishing setup. You will identify those and you will fix it. And over time, the journey will become smoother. An Easter egg as well, putting all the content through the translation process really does help you truffle up things to fix. Once went through a project where I had to push through hundreds of thousands of words for translation. And in that time, I was the most annoying person on Jira because I was finding issues from like 5 or 6 years ago. No one had maybe in the company looked at this content for a couple of years, and I'd just be throwing up a ticket for a random typo out the blue. So again, if you are that person, you will be a total menace for a few months, but ultimately you are raising the quality of your docs, and that's the win for everyone. Everyone benefits from better glossaries and style guides. As I said, talking to people across your organization, really thinking, are we speaking about things cohesively? Are we working in silos and actually adapting our own little specific vocabularies in different bits of the org? And as we know, customers don't just read your docs, they read your front pages too. They maybe read your blogs, they're reading your Twitter accounts. It's much better for everyone if you're all communicating in that one voice, if you're using that shared vocabulary. Localization will really help catalyze this process. Everyone benefits from the work you do to make your localization better, not just internally, but also your users, thinking about that things like accessibility. If you start to write more simple, consistent sentences, if you start to take down really complex punctuation, if you start to write really, really declarative headers, everyone is going to gain from that. Hooray! So, maybe this talk has already got you thinking up lots of tweaks you could be making to your docs. Hopefully it's not put you off translating and localizing your documentation altogether. Whether you are going with humans though, or forging a path with the machines, really good luck to you. Embrace the level of pedantism that you're about to experience, the perspectives that you'll learn and the knowledge that you will gain in this process, because I can guarantee you will not go through this in any region without learning something new and grammatically fascinating. There's a quote that I really like from Ernest Hemingway from his book A Movable Feast. Maybe away from Paris, I could write about Paris, as in Paris I could write about Michigan. And what he means by that is, out of the context of being in Paris, he can really conjure it more loosely in his head and think about it and articulate what it is to be in Paris. Doing your translation and localization process will kind of do the same thing for you with your own internal grammatical style rules. You really start to think about tonal choices and articulate maybe something that you made quite casually, but why are we doing that? And what's the reason behind it? What's that kind of unconscious world behind the words? And this will help you really think about things in the future and maybe make better choices, things with a stronger movement behind them. And again, this is better for everyone. I promise, though, once you take your content overseas, you'll never see your writing or editing in the same way again. That's a great thing. So buckle up, don't forget to bring your snacks. There's a whole new world waiting for you.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk.
Hey, no worries, thank you. Thanks for watching. Hello.
I don't know if you've been watching the chatter and the chat, but I guess my question at the moment is, Jeroen, so while I favor the imperative, why not? Do you have data? Do you have info on why it isn't easily translatable in that sort of thing?
So I understand this is a controversial one, and I think coming from as someone who's both been on the writing side and the translation side, I totally understand why people feel kind of sometimes as well, particularly when you are saying writing for localization, if there's an established thing like gerunds, that resistance to kind of making the change is that you often kind of encounter that. And I think particularly gerunds are quite emotive because we use them so prolifically in tech documentation. In English is the cool thing though. A gerund is not like a universal grammatical concept. It's not something that occurs in every language. And although in English we kind of accept the ambiguity, if you think of a gerund, it's sort of like a parenthetical phrase, right? Like you can pack so many ideas. If I'm then translating that into something like Japanese and I'm like, oh, but do they actually mean, what do they mean here with this verb? Can I pinpoint this exact thing so I can find that mirror match? And I, maybe I'm very used to working with the suite of documentation. Maybe I know the company and I kind of know, I know by now what they mean when they tend to use a certain phrase, like creating this thing, doing this thing. But maybe I am just a third party translator and someone's throwing me the content and there's quite like a ambiguous gerund within that. For me to find that right match and to convey that nonce is going to be really, really difficult. It's also just extra cognitive load for the translator. And when you work in the translator market, it's quite common to get tens of thousands of words chucked to you in a tiny deadline. And they're like, when I say about translators giving up, it's because you've got 12 hours and you've got to prioritize every single nuance there. And you're building a roadblock for that poor translator in that process because they're having to look back and check the context and go down the paragraph and like, what am I really trying to say in this header? Which you can kind of solve that problem just by writing it directly.
We lost Mike's video for a moment. Sorry about that. All the kings. I guess at the risk of turning maybe a sharp pivot from the conversation that Mike was starting, I figured I'd just go back to some of the things that you highlighted in your slides, which I really loved. That quote from John Berger's Confabulations. I'm completely unfamiliar with John Berger. Is he the same person who had that TV show on the BBC?
Yeah, he was actually. Yeah, he wrote like a design book. But I guess particularly in the UK, it's sort of like the 101 for everyone who starts any course on design.
Oh, just updating my notes here. I guess I'm not completely unfamiliar with him, but you had, so I'm going to read the quote now. Your slide had said, true translation is not a binary affair between two languages, but a triangular affair. And the third point of the triangle being what lay behind the words of the original text before it was written. And I thought that was really lovely because, I guess for a lot of us who don't spend a lot of time thinking about translation and localization, it's another step to actually recall that, like the quote says, it's not a binary affair. I was going to pull some questions from some people who have pasted their questions in our chat, so I'm going to look away from the screen while I do so. I guess on the note of translation not being a binary affair, somebody had asked whether the use of computer-aided translation or machine translation increases the chance of rogue English slipping through. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I think it depends as well on what sort of translation system you're using. Obviously, there are a lot. And I think even in the tech world, I think translation software is it's a little bit of an unloved area sometimes. I think you could almost, if you were looking for a great startup idea, if you went in, you were like, right, I'm going to do like this best in class everything for a captive system, I think you would make so much money. I did find with the last project I worked in, our tool, our company that we used, they came with like a crawler that you could use to crawl your site. So when the new English came, it would pull it in. It definitely, at first particularly, we definitely found that it was missing quite a lot of the English as it was coming through. And we just have to manually review it at that point. But actually, we were lucky enough to have a developer on our team working on that content site. So he was able to engage in a dialogue with the company so that we could make sure that our integrations were tighter and we could kind of troubleshoot and find those flaws. I think that was super, super helpful on the process, actually. I think if it just been me managing that alone with the translation company or our head of localization, I think it would have been a lot slower. I think having someone who knows that technical back end in that flow can really, really help. I would say it is something that maybe you just need to be aware of when you start the project as you go through, when you are checking. As I said, maybe you do have necessary English, maybe there's brand terms there, so you kind of need to be aware that this is a feature, it's not a bug. But it's kind of something that it's better to know that it's going to happen, I guess. and to, again, shop around, ask for samples, ask to play on people's systems when you start thinking about your process. Maybe just don't go for the first vendor that you try, because it may be that someone else works much better with your site.
To me, I guess it's easy to forget that we might end up relying a bit too much on machines when language is obviously very human, so we'll keep needing to get human feedback. I'm going to fish out another question. Somebody's got a question about the translation of images and screenshots, which in their experience has been expensive and complex. Any pointers there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, number one, I would sort of say it's quite hard to do with the written question. It would kind of depend on the nature of your screenshot. So say if it's like an example of your platform and you want to have translated platform images, so like that localized language, I'm doing a doc in French, I want that French user experience completely. You are obviously going to have to go and recreate those screenshots in French too, if that's your ultimate goal. And that is expensive and laborious. I mean, if you're thinking about if you wanted to go and update every single English screenshot, that is going to take time. And it is possible to automate. But again, you're going to have to just consider the cost of the automation. If, however, it's something like an architectural diagram, then a really easy way, and this is, again, something that's maybe better for all your users, is just to have a numbered key within the diagram, perhaps, and then have that writing in that body text explaining what the key is. So you're not having words on the diagram, because as we know, words on a diagram can be hard to read. It can bring down accessibility anyway. For all users, it makes things like alt text more complex, because you don't want to have tons and tons of alt text, but you also don't want the user to miss important information. So actually thinking, how can I take this text off the diagram? How can I keep things as simple as possible? Instantly there, you're making the process easier and cheaper and more lightweight.
I'm also glancing at the chat and looking at Kristen's comment about she and her team are working on a Japanese English translation guide. And, I may have missed, entire chunks of your presentation, unfortunately, but not because I didn't want to watch all of it. I find that, I don't know, I'm very interested in translation and localization. So there may have been some portions where you did discuss a translation guide, which I don't think we hear about very much, nearly as often as a style guide. Can you talk to us more?
Sure. So, I think actually Microsoft has some really great ones. They are publicly surfaceable, so you can go in and look for them. But this is basically, you're thinking when you are translating your English, you're kind of thinking about the local teams. You're finding that what's the tonal guidance going to be like? It may not actually be the same tonal guidance, because as I said at the beginning, like your customers may have different levels of formality that they expect. For example, like in Japan, I said earlier, I was sort of doing a London Shoreditch startup voice there of this is wicked, it's amazing, and just translating that may be quite shocking for some customers in Tokyo, for example. So the translation for the English, that style guidance may be quite different, and that's really useful for everyone to reference. Again, if you have, say, someone who's working with your third-party translation agency, and you're probably not going to find a 10-language polyglot who can look in and understand all your docs, but they can look at this bilingual style guide. So if your local team, say in France or Germany, is coming to you and saying, there is a problem because of this thing, they can point to the thing in your style guide and say, they're not doing this, so you can deal with the agency and understand the context. Or if maybe you don't have such a massive team, but you're just looking at user feedback and people are saying it's a bit weird, your translators follow the English structure, so the translation is actually really strange, which is something you can get, because translators will almost be too faithful to the original source and they won't take the localization far enough. You may need to sort of push in that sense. So again, you can kind of capture this in the style guide. It's kind of a good way to find the gotchas as well in your text. If there are certain things, certain brand concepts that you do, again, having a bilingual style guide, you want to articulate that clearly. Maybe you don't want these things to be localized. You want this to be a universal concept wherever your company goes. Having that in that bilingual style guide will make sure, and you're having that translated in your bilingual style guide as well, so that's being imparted to everyone. But if it's something like a really marketing sort of comsy message, you can really make sure that's filtered through properly, and the same to every region, so you have that consistency there. There's strangely, or not so strangely, a lot of room for creativity, a lot of gray area in the process of translation.
Go ahead.
I was sort of doing editing on a French bilingual style guide, so they'd written English and it was French instructions beneath. And I thought what was really funny was the person who'd written it was sort of picking at the English, actually, not the translation, because like English has too many exclamation marks, so we don't want to have this for customers. English doesn't do this very well. And I just thought that was so fascinating to kind of look into and be like, oh, this is obviously like a problem with how they were, if you did directly translation of our docs, but it really made you think back to like, oh, these are some choices that we're making here that like our team finds hard to work with, like with the local materials. So that's really, really interesting feedback as well.
Yeah, it's a brave new world that is probably not so new, but still feels a little bit new for a lot of us. I'm just going to double check the time. Perhaps we'll just squeeze in one more question, and we'll leave it up to you, Lucy, if you'd like to stay behind and answer some other questions over the chat. But Chen had a question about a concept of simplified user interface. Are you familiar with that?
She mean kind of like simplified technical English, or is that something I've not used, but I've seen discussions about it, so I can talk on that. But
it sounds like it's more for graphics, diagrams. She mentions abstract screenshots. Interesting concept.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar on that, but it's definitely something I think we'll go and look into.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
Yes.
I think we are on the edge of running out of time. So would you like to stay behind and answer any questions? You're free to turn off your video and microphone if you like. But
sure, yeah, if anyone has any extra questions, I'm happy to answer, or I can just jump on the chat if any come up then.
Okay,
take it ad
great.
hoc.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my microphone and camera, but I'll be here around in spirit. Thank you.
Bye.